It's time for the Bible Geek. I am that geek. Robert M. Price, postmodern, deconstruct, super-powered demigod. It's time at long last for the Bible Geek, and I'm the geek, Robert M. Price. Haven't been geeking for a bit, as you may have noticed, because I've got a whole bunch of writing and proofreading and editing to do, but I'm at a brief point where I can go back to my beloved geekery with you. So I wanted to get some questions answered today, or bluffed, as the case may be. And I must, however, take hat in hand and let you know that if you were thinking of helping out the old Bible geek and his family, things are a little bit rough now and it would come in handy. But probably rough for you too, so I won't take offense if you can't help, right? I hate being harassed too, so forgive me for this and forget it if you want. So let's say we get back to some exciting questions. Here's one from Joshua Voshell. This, as you can tell, came in around Halloween. Sorry about this. Well, it's not too far in the back. I was raised a fundamentalist Christian, and my mother never really liked Halloween. Evil, satanic day of evil, and such. She would tell me how it was of the devil, and we should have no part of it. Although I do remember celebrating harvest, which boils down to being a sanitized version of the holiday anyway. Over the years, I have become enamored by Halloween. I love the aesthetic of the holiday as well as the general fall season. Since I know you're also fond of the holiday, I wanted to know how your October has been going, or went. He knows how long this takes to surface. Also, if you would share any fun traditions, I would enjoy it. I've been enjoying my monster cereal and working my way through a list of horror films. Well, Josh, that's just what I've been doing. Well, not the cereal, but, different strokes for different folks. I guess one of my big holiday or Halloween traditions is to munch the candy we ostensibly get for the trick-or-treaters, even though we never get any. Well, I guess I don't mind too much. But another one is watching horror movies, as you do wisely. My daughter Victoria and I made a schedule. You might possibly have seen it on Facebook, of about, I guess, 31 monster movies that we wanted to do. That would bring it to, obviously, one a day for the whole month, because we kind of view October, the whole thing, as Halloween. Well, if you've ever been here, some of you know we sort of view the whole darn year as Halloween. But at any rate, we started watching them, and let's see, we got through 53, and most of them are old favorites, like the Universal horror movies. I'd say the one bum one we saw was The Invisible Woman. I'd seen a few minutes of that on TV, and who knew it would be as lame as it actually turned out to be. But we saw all kinds of goodies beside the Universal classics. Though there, I have to admit, we didn't watch any mummy movies after the great Karloff mummy. Didn't watch any either of the Creature from the Black Lagoon sequels, maybe some other time. Did watch Dracula's Daughter and Son of Dracula, great stuff. And watched all the Invisible Man films. Never seen the Invisible Agent before. Very, very good. Surprisingly good. And so then we watched a bunch of non-Universals like Mark of the Vampire, Return of the Vampire, both starring Lugosi, interestingly. Return of the Vampire is based on a script for a direct sequel to Dracula, but there was some problem with the studio, and so who was it? I guess it was Columbia? Yeah, I think it was that did that Return of the Vampire, and they had to change the backstory a bit, but you could kind of tell who was supposed to be who, and he couldn't be Dracula anymore. I don't really know why, because Dracula is not a copyrighted character. But he became Dr. Armand Tesla. Oh, it was great. We saw a bunch of Hammer flicks. Curse of Frankenstein, Evil of Frankenstein, Curse of the Werewolf, Horror of Dracula, my favorite, Brides of Dracula. Oh boy, what fun. And then some later ones like, I Was a Teenage Werewolf, Blood of Dracula. Then some real classics like the Picture of Dorian Gray, Eye of the Devil with David Niven, Deborah Carr, Donald Pleasance, Sharon Tate, and so on. Oh, that is an unsung great movie. We saw both the Frederick March and Spencer Tracy versions of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, both terrific. Curse of the Demon, based on the M.R. James story, Casting the Runes, and what a great film fest. And shortly, here in November, we're going to be starting Kaiju Month, watching, Japanese and other giant monster movies, culminating, where I suppose technically we should have begun with King Kong and Son of Kong on Thanksgiving. A weird tradition I have for that, because when I was a kid, back up in New Jersey, the New York channel, WOR, Channel 9, used to inexplicably run those two movies and King Kong versus Godzilla on Thanksgiving, and I'd watch them while I was sneaking biscuits and toasted pecans and other goodies that were in the works for the Thanksgiving dinner, and so we've always done that. And so then December, Christmas movies, of course, and then January, 50s science fiction and horror, and so on down the line. It's just great fun. By the way, this idea of Halloween being demonized, that always sticks in my craw. That is just, it's an example of gross religious ignorance, because this idea that it's a satanic holiday, if somebody doesn't know the background of it, yes, I can see where they'd get the idea that it's satanic, but it's actually an ecclesiastical holiday. It's a church holiday. There's an order of service for All Hallows Eve, right? The eve of All Hallows Day or All Saints Day. And it's exactly the logic in the Disney film Fantasia, where they have this cartoon going on concurrently with Mussorgsky's Night on Bald Mountain. It shows the idea of Halloween is that here's the last gasp revel of the demons and ghouls and stuff like that before the dawn of All Saints Day, which kicks them back into their graves and renders them utterly powerless. And the reason you're having a festival and kids are dressing up, or they used to, as monsters and demons and witches and stuff, which I still ought to do, is that you're mocking them. Like Martin Luther said, the devil, proud spirit, cannot endure to be mocked. Well, that's what you're doing with having kids dress up as monsters. It's just so sad that fundamentalists cheat themselves out of a Christian holiday. It's not even exactly a Christianization of a pagan holiday. How do you pronounce it? I forget. I think there are various different pronunciations, but Samhain. It's supposed to be based on that, but that just means end of summer. Some people believe that the ghosts of the dead were about that day. Yeah, maybe so, but Halloween is not that. Halloween is a Christian holiday. If anybody ought to skip it, it's not the fundamentalists, it's the atheists. But anyhow, I'm glad you gave me the opportunity to vent all of that nonsense. Yes, it's the ramblings of a senile old curmudgeon, but what do you expect? This from, this is kind of a long one, I think. I don't want to attribute it to the wrong person. Is this a single long question? Yeah, okay, here we go. Greetings, Herr Dr. Geek. Why is he saying that? Well, because once I made the mistake of admitting that if you got 2 PhDs in Germany, they actually address you as Herr Doctor, Dr. Frankenstein or whatever. I certainly did not mean anybody should ever use that pretentious title of me, and I guess I can see that it's a joke here, so that's all right. Anyway, it says, this is J.C. Drake from your nation's capital, sweating out the summer, sorry about this, folks, by reading Cotton Mather. As relates to Mather, I recently stumbled across one of his seemingly lesser books, the Brontologia Sacra, The Voice of God in Glorious Thunder, which contains sermons by Mather and John Astwood, along with some additional editorializing. I was barely familiar with this class of writing, but remembered, by the way, this is totally new to me, but remembered that there is also a brontologion in the Dead Sea Scrolls. For those unfamiliar, brontologia are prophecies divined from hearing the voice of God or gods under certain circumstances during a thunderstorm. To me, it sounds like a kind of auditory pareidolia. Is that right? I'm not familiar with that word. Paredolia. An auditory pareidolia like EVP or electronic voice phenomena, in which people hear the voice of so-called ghosts recorded on audio equipment. Listening to a rumbling storm, the noises might well sound like words. I was surprised to discover Mather going in for this stuff. However, this raises an interesting question. There are surviving brontologia. Doesn't that remind you of brontosaurus? Remember what that means? The thunder lizards? Yeah, because they shook the ground. They were so heavy, just like I do. There are surviving brontologia from the ancient world attributed to all sorts of miraculous figures, including King David. But knowing as we do that Yahweh was originally a storm god, he who causes rain or lightning to fall, that makes me wonder if the origins of much of our biblical teaching might lie in the phenomenon of auditory pareidolia. Is much of the Bible simply a series of brontologion? Interesting speculation. In Exodus 19 and 20, it's thundering on Mount Sinai when God is handing down the Big Ten. In Job 37:4, God is thundering with majestic voice. In 2 Samuel 22:14, it says, the Lord thundered from heaven, the Most High made his voice heard. In this, his voice and thunder are the same thing. Fascinating. Job, or, you could also say that this was priestcraft, and that the priests who wrote this stuff claimed to have read it off of the thunderclaps, which people were actually hearing. Oh, I can interpret that. This is fascinating. Job 37 makes it especially clear that when there's a storm, that's basically God making himself manifest to human beings, and that his voice is that of the thunder. In a desert environment, the presence of storms might be rare and especially terrifying. Jeremiah 10:13 states, when he utters his voice, there is a tumult of waters in the heavens, and he causes the clouds to ascend from the end of the earth. He makes lightning for the rain and brings out the wind from his storehouses. Later on, they took that kind of literally and believed in the elemental spirits, the stoichia, who were angels in charge of the various storehouses of rain, snowflakes, and so on. Anyway, there are numerous examples of the voice of God being made synonymous with the sound of thunder. There are references to the sons of thunder, etc., etc. Boanerges, which I think is a reference to Castor and Pollux, the sons of Zeus the Thunderer. Right? Okay. I've always wondered what was the vehicle for the earliest so-called divine inspiration in the Bible. Drugs, trance states, pure imagination, as Willy Wonka says. I'm probably jumping the gun, and you're going to mention this, but think about in the book of Revelation, where the revelator says that he wrote down what the seven thunders said, and then an angel told him, hey, seal that up, don't circulate it. We're not told why, something I think is very fascinating. and I have a story coming out pretty soon in an anthology called Cthulhu Invictus, where I have a kind of Lovecraftian take on the Seven Thunders. In fact, I've done that before in a couple of other tales. But anyway, I think there's a clue in the Bible itself. Job 16:14 says, "Behold, these are the fringes of his ways, and how faint a word we hear of him, but his mighty thunder who can understand?" Well, these quotes remind me of why I love the Bible so much. Such great poetry. What if you claimed you could understand? This is the way of the shaman, the ability to read the mind of hidden forces, whether it be in tea leaves or through an oracle. If you believe that God is speaking through thunder, it's not much of a logical leap to be able to believe that someone among you can interpret those words in the same way the priests at Delphi interpreted the rantings of the oracles, or in the way that Joseph Smith could translate ancient Egyptian, quotes around translate. You might think of speaking in tongues too, right? Those utterances are not translated; they're interpreted, like Daniel interprets the handwriting on the wall. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. That's not in any language really. It's like he's interpreting it like a dream, and so the same thing here, yeah, and also. Deborah used to judge Israel, hear cases, and settle them, sitting beneath the terebinth or the oak or something. Well, yeah, she would listen to the rustling of the leaves while in a trance state, and that would tell her the wisdom of God. Or Moses made laws for the people in the wilderness of Kadesh, sitting beside the brook. Well, that meant that in an oracular state he would listen to the babbling of the brook, and it would flip the switch. He would hear it as the voice of God. And like you say, with shamans, that isn't priestcraft necessarily. They're in a dissociative state, and it kind of, I don't know, like tarot cards or a Rorschach test, stimulates the subconscious. Let's see, back to the question. A guy goes up the mountain, survives a big storm, comes back down the mountain and says, "Okay, boys, I took notes. No more shrimp cocktail and poly cotton blends are out. Any thoughts on this possibility? Many thanks, and may the old ones devour you first and me next." You know, that is really, really fascinating. I'd say, in all probability, you're right. Now, I'm not sure if that'd be true about the so-called writing prophets, where you have extensive poetic material, but who knows what inspired them, right? I mean, they didn't necessarily get word, they weren't claiming necessarily it was word for word what the source said, especially if the source was speaking in unknown tongues, so to speak. You have Hermes as the interpreter because the word of God is discontinuous with human speech. So you have to have some kind of a real jump. Excuse me. Let me interpret that sneeze. Anyway, yeah, I think you got a really good theory there. That makes an awful lot of sense to me, and I would assume you're right. I mean, as you say, the Dead Sea Scrolls have the collection of brontologia. Thunder Perfect Mind, let's not forget that. Great, thanks. Jason in Bridgewater, Mass. says, "I've often heard it said that there's I'm doing Maine and New Hampshire, sorry. I've often heard it said that there's no mention of hell in the Old Testament. Now, perhaps there's no specific mention of a place of fire and brimstone, but aren't there passages about punishment in the afterlife? For example, Daniel 12:2 talks about the dead being raised to either eternal life or eternal contempt. Ecclesiastes 12:13 also speaks of God bringing every deed to judgment in the context of the end of one's life. What saith the Geek?" Well, Jason, that strikes me as a little elusive. I know what you mean, but it's pretty interesting that once we know they had a doctrine of post-mortem torment, they're not shy about talking about it. Whereas these things are not that, these references are not that clear. Daniel, for instance, what does it mean to be raised to eternal contempt? Does that just mean that you're despised forever? I mean, this seems to be in the eye of the beholder, not the beheld. Right? The good guys are raised to eternal life. Okay, that's something predicated of them. Eternal contempt. Who knows what that means? It's an odd way of putting it too. Contempt that others have for you is not necessarily the same thing as torment or punishment. So that's a little too ambiguous for me. And in Ecclesiastes 12:13, that's late enough. It wouldn't be surprising to find afterlife implications, but it's not necessarily clear that it doesn't mean just what it does in one of the pastoral epistles. Some men's deeds go before them, like they're obvious enough to anybody, but others follow after, but are eventually revealed. It's like somebody dies and you're looking through their papers, or people start coming forward and saying, this guy wasn't what he was cracked up to be, and you find out how corrupt they were and so on, because they're no longer around to keep the secret and somebody else blabs. I'm not too sure that isn't what it means in Ecclesiastes, especially when you think of Proverbs, and another item in the canon of the wisdom literature, where the good name is the only prospect for immortality, and immortality of reputation. A good name is worth loads of bucks and so forth, and you don't want to be ill thought of, especially since that may be the only way in which you are immortal. Sheol, the pit, the grave, that seems to be a netherworld, but not of torment. Everybody goes there, just like an ancient Babylonian religion. There is a reference to a fiery kingdom, Tophet or Gehenna, in the valley of the sons of Hinnom at the base of Mount Zion. Mount Zion being the axis mundi, the axle of the world, and above at the top is the temple, the gateway to heaven, and at the bottom there is Tophet or Gehenna, which is the open mouth of the fiery realm of Moloch, who is fed with human infant sacrifice. But that's not a question of conscious torment of the babies or of anybody else. It's just that's where the fire god lives, and people thought to appease him, I suppose. But there's no implication of anybody suffering in there until much later in the intertestamental period. So it's not clear to me that there is a hell. I mean, it's hardly clear that there's a heaven in the Old Testament that anybody is going to after death. Because remember, with Elijah and Enoch, and implicitly Moses, well, let's just stick with Elijah and Enoch, they go to heaven because they don't die, right? They don't die and go to heaven. They go to heaven because they don't die. They're not left on earth to die. And did they, and of course that's because they were originally sun gods, and it was the symbolism of the rising sun. But anyway, yeah, so I have a hunch it's not that clear there's a hell there. John Nahor Jagerson says, I grew up a Mormon and have always loved the sermon or psalm-like passages in the Book of Mormon. For example, you're probably familiar with Nephi's lament. "O wretched man that I am," sounds a little like Paul in Romans, from the book of 2nd Nephi. I've always figured that many of those passages were based on 19th century evangelical sermons. If that assumption is correct or probable, would you answer the following two questions? One, can you recommend any good books about the sermons and writings among 19th century Protestant and evangelical preachers of the time? I'm interested in how they were written and how they spread from one church to another. I'm afraid I cannot. I really have no idea. But I would just look up on Amazon something about early American sermons or frontier homiletics or something like that. They might have something, but I sure don't know. I will say that in a book, I think it's New Approaches to the Book of Mormon, an anthology from Signature Books, it's filled with interesting essays, and one of them deals with sources available to Joseph Smith, commentaries and things like that, and if you can find that book, it's probably still in print, that might be of interest. Okay, two, what was it about 19th century American Christianity that led to so many new religious movements? I know Mormons, Christian Scientists, Jehovah's Witnesses, I think that was early 20th century, Unitarians, Seventh-day Adventists, etc., all developed during that time frame, and I wonder if there was some kind of common denominator that drove religious innovation. Well, partly it was the charismatic element of revivalism, the manifestations of the Spirit that made people open to dreams and visions and doctrinal innovations. Partly it was religious overchoice, like with Joseph Smith. He lived in the burned over district, as they called it, burned over because the fires of revival had ripped through there so many times, the Methodists, the Baptists, and so on. Joseph Smith and his family went to various revivals and joined different churches, and he just found it confusing. And he said, "Wait a minute, these churches are so different." Of course, they weren't all that different, but there's many other types of Christianity that are much more different than these intra-Protestant type groups. But if you're in that little microcosm, you can't help but say, why do they differ so much on infant baptism and all sorts of things? He said that he finally said that an angel appeared to him and said, you're right. These people have all gone off the track ever since the apostolic age. God wants you to start up the real thing again. Well, yeah, I think he was just sick of and confused by the diversity. How do you know which one's right? Maybe none of them are. And then the angel says to him, "Bingo, Joe, that's right." With the Jehovah's Witnesses, I know Charles Taze Russell was disgusted with the hellfire preaching. So was William Ellery Channing with the New England Unitarians. This cannot be Christian thought, Christian doctrine. Let me take a closer look at the Bible. And Russell felt that no, there's no clear teaching on hell, just like we were just talking about in the previous question. He said, well, now that I've started scrutinizing that, let me take another look. The Plymouth Brethren and John Nelson Darby over in England, same thing, though he did believe in hell, but it was church organization that he rethought and started the Brethren. I think it was a Church of Ireland bishop or something before that. Christian Science, this is part of the New Thought movement. There were it was a time of ferment with people taking seriously all sorts of ideas like spiritualism. That became a huge religious movement. People thought they could contact the dead, and I don't know, I'm guessing it's the apocalyptic fervor and that the end of the world is coming. The Seventh-day Adventists certainly believed in that, or the Millerites from whom they descend, and the Jehovah's Witnesses, they were big on predicting the end of the age, and these things often go together. Attention to the old prophecies of the Bible and thinking you have an insight into them, and what do you know, they're talking about us. Plus the idea of new prophecies, that the Spirit in the last days, right? There's that link, as in Acts 2. He can inspire, he fulfills old prophecy and creates new prophecy. And, well, even Christian Science, as weird as it may sound, that's based on these statements where Jesus says, your own faith has made you whole, and that kind of thing. Well, how could that be? Well, maybe the idea of evil and illness are really illusions. That's a kind of a hyper-Platonic view almost. So it was kind of like the New Age movement of the 70s on through today, where people are just saying, okay, the staid old traditional religions, I'm sick of them, they don't do anything for me, but there's got to be some spiritual reality. Let me see if I can find it. And so you have these kind of things I talk about in my book, top secret, and one morphs into another, and I think it was just that daring courage to receive new revelations. That was a sort of climate of experimentalism up there, begotten by revivalism. Now, why that didn't happen to the same extent on the western frontier, I don't know, but there were a lot of things going on there too. Mormonism caught on big once it moved out there, and then Pentecostalism, right? That grew like wildfire in the Midwest and then in California. It's fascinating. There's a famous book, not so famous that I can remember the author's name, but The Burned Over District, which zeroes in on Joseph Smith's setting, and that probably adds some insight. Hey, Joe in Georgia. I've heard you say before that you're not a big fan of the work of biblical scholar N.T. Wright, but I hear his name come up again and again in debates about biblical studies, especially from conservatives. He's called upon so often that I've begun to wonder if I should read him. I'm certainly not opposed to reading people with a conservative take on the Bible, but I don't want to waste my time and money on authors who offer the same old rationalizations I've read before. Could you go into a little more depth about your opinion on Wright? Does he offer any interesting or novel interpretations that are worth reading, even if you ultimately disagree? Or is he just another apologist hack who has, for some reason, acquired a reputation for scholarly distinction among conservative Christians? I think he is a hack. I once got into trouble at the Jesus Seminar. Boy, did I tick off Bernard Brandon Scott with this. I said Wright is just Jerry Falwell in a better suit. He strikes me as disingenuous, as a snake oil salesman. The credibility he has is partly because he has a good pedigree with his educational background, which admittedly, I mean, that's the flip side of this credential mania that, Earl Doherty doesn't have a PhD? Well, let's not bother reading. What are you, stupid? His credential is what he wrote. Take a look at it and judge on the basis of that. Well, I think Wright is the naked emperor. I just see nothing. I mean, it's just a lot of pedantry, in my opinion. Having read his book, The Resurrection of the Son of God, and I think I read one on Paul and the covenant and all that. It's nothing new. It's weak arguments, and he's really doing systematic theology, proof texting a lot of ancient sources. And I just find it, forgive me for saying so, but worthless. It's a waste of time. He's trying to snow you. I think for all his erudition, he has a superficial, dogmatically defined view of things, and I just don't find anything new or interesting there. That's pretty severe, but I got to be honest about it. Let me say Greg Boyd and Paul Eddy in their book, The Jesus Legend, which devotes some critical attention to me. I know these guys, and I like them. They're good guys. They at least are dipping into other material, anthropology, orality studies and things like that. I think they misapply the stuff, but I did a blurb for that book. It is at least is trying new things. So if you're going to read any conservative apologist, I'd say Boyd and Eddy. Though I would recommend reading my essay rebutting that in John Loftus's book. Oh boy, which one was it? It was one of his first two Prometheus anthologies. And then I've got, I think in Jesus is Dead from American Atheist Press, I have a long review of N.T. Wright's book on the resurrection. That goes into a lot more depth and detail than I can even begin to do here. But I think you'd find those pretty interesting. David says, on the July 24th episode at minute 35 of Father Simon Says, trademark. This is a show, obviously. Sorry about that. A listener asked if Muslims worship the same God as Christians and Jews do, and he ended up making the distinction that Muslims did not worship the same God, but they did pray to the same God. I'm wondering if you would make the same distinction, and if you could give your views on this. Well, it's obvious to anybody reading the Quran, they're talking about the God of the Bible. There's no question about that. They paraphrase and rewrite stories about Noah and Abraham and Moses and Jesus. It's absolutely obvious. They're talking about the biblical God. Now, their doctrine of God is different because it's non-Trinitarian. But if you think Jews and Christians have the same God, then you can't say Muslims don't. It's very obvious. Now, some people start saying that, well, wait a minute, God is a Trinity, and if you don't think God's a Trinity, you're worshiping a false God. Come on, come on. That's just ridiculous. It might be a serious failing that if God is a Trinity, you don't think he is. I mean, that might be a big problem. I don't deny it, but you can't say you're not worshiping the same God. I mean, that's just ridiculous. As to this distinction between praying to and worshiping, I don't get that at all. I don't understand what the heck they're saying unless they mean, well, they're praying to him, but the heavens are bronze because he's not listening to anything from them. And since they've got it all wrong, they're not really worshiping. But I don't even understand that. I'm trying to make some sort of sense of it. And I am no fan of Islam. I find it fascinating, but I'm afraid my patience and sympathy for that religion has dried up recently. In my next Zarathustra Speaks column, which I think you may find interesting and some may repudiate the old geek for, it's called I Slam Islam. Took off the ecumenical gloves, and you might be interested in reading that. You can go to my website, robertmprice.mindvendor.com, and you can subscribe for free to Zarathustra Speaks, my monthly column, and this next one out in a few days now will offer that sure to be controversial screed on Islam, the religion of peace. You want a piece of me? Okay, greetings to his geekiness from Korea. I would do an insulting attempt at an Asian accent, but it's Jason M. Spence, and he lives in Korea but isn't a Korean. Right? So, okay, I recently watched a lecture concerning various forms of schizophrenia and how it pertains to religion. The lecturer, I believe to be Professor Robert Sapolsky, though I can't recall exactly, he had been observing data related to diagnosed schizophrenics, mild and severe, as well as a return to revelation. I'm sorry, he had been observing data related to diagnosed schizophrenics, mild and severe, as well as a relation to revelation, hearing God, quote-unquote, ability to go into trances, etc. It was shown throughout his lecture that severe forms of schizophrenia had quite negative effects on a community, murderers, rapists, for example. However, those who exhibited a mild form of the disease were often perceived as having a divine connection, an ability to communicate with spirits, devils, and the like, and thus they were held with great regard within the community. Let me just swerve off here. There was a famous study done by, I think, Spong and Spiro. I could be wrong about the Spong part. I could be confusing somebody with Bishop Spong. But I know Spiro, as in Spiro Agnew, was one of the anthropologists. And these guys decided to go to Asia and study and interview shamans who, of course, go into trances, visit the spirit world, bring back news and oracles and all that. They hear voices, they see visions, and the Western scholars said, now these guys sound like textbook cases of schizophrenia. Let's go check them out. Well, they gave them a battery of tests, the MMPI and all that stuff, and they found these guys were as sane as the day is long, based on any conventional yardstick. And apparently it had to do with the fact that wherever their visions come from and their auditory hallucinations or whatever, they have such an important function in their communities that the only aberrant behavior, is it aberrant, I don't know, is the sacred behavior of the trances and all of that stuff. Suppose, however, you have these problems, these anomalies that do not fit into a community. Well, you're just some kind of a street person or a thug or something like that. So it has to do with the social community element. In fact, I would say that all prophets are hallucinating and have delusions. If, however, the beliefs and the practices that they propagate, like the ghost dance or the cargo cult mania, so-called, if you can make them the basis of a functioning community, in effect what happens is it's kind of a benign delusion, and the more people accept it, and it's a help to them in some way, well, then you're talking about a religion, not madness anymore. Think of Kris Kringle in Miracle on 34th Street. His is a delusion for good, the doctor says. Well, yeah, I think that's what happened with the religion. Somebody thought they had a vision or heard a voice telling them to go promote the kingdom of heaven. Well, if the ethics that come from that are wholesome, and they might as well be, then what the heck? I remember a MASH episode from long ago where there's this bomber pilot is brought into the MASH unit, or something's wrong with him, and he's flipped. He now thinks he's Jesus. And Sidney, the shrink, says it appears this man had such difficulty with all the killing he had done in the war that he just had to recoil from it, and he flipped over to the exact opposite, the Lamb of God, and so on. Well, as people talked to him, and he said calmly and quietly that he was Jesus, and he blessed Radar and his teddy bear and all that, you got the impression that Radar, the most childlike of the characters, really connected with this guy and believed that he was Jesus, and in a sense he was. Very strange. Also in Ordet, or The Word, a great Danish film, there's this guy who went to seminary and studied too much Soren Kierkegaard, his father says, and he flipped out and he thinks he's Jesus and so on. Well, by the end of the movie, he actually raises somebody from the dead, and it's this thin line between delusion and revelation, implying that all revelation is delusion, but it is somehow opening up potentialities that we ordinarily ignore. I don't know what to make of that. But yeah, I think all meaning is a kind of delusion that we project on an inherently meaningless universe, and we ought to do it. We live out fictions of our own creation, or that we have inherited. So enough for my sermon. But there are people like Charles Manson whose behavior is too destructive. You can't have it going on, and these people, we say, are devils or demon possessed. Okay, I'm sorry, Jason, I hijacked the thing. He continues, my question relates to those prophets mentioned in the Bible. Assuming they're historical, can we infer that those prophets, such as Jeremiah, Moses, Paul, Abraham, and other such prophets who, quote, communicated, unquote, with God, were merely undiagnosed schizophrenics, simply engaging conversation with the voices within their own mind, rather than willful deception? Yes, I think so. I'm sure that's the case. Might be interesting to read Julian Jaynes, Jaynes, the origin of consciousness in the breakdown of the bicameral mind. He argues at great length that in earlier eras the brain hemispheres were not as closely associated, and so that one brain hemisphere would hear words from the other, not knowing it was part of the same brain, because it wasn't part of the same mind, so to speak, and that early prophets were hearing their own thoughts as if from another. That's certainly possible, and that's an interesting treatment of it. But yeah, I mean, there have been probably fakers and all that, but I knew some Moonies pretty well who told me how Reverend Moon operated, and that he, when he had a plan, and this guy thought very globally, right? He was the Lord of the Second Advent and so on. He wanted to defeat communism, and before he died, he felt that he had, battling it on the spirit world. This guy had been nearly killed by the North Koreans, and oh boy, what a mess. Well, somebody that knew him pretty well said that Reverend Moon, when he hatched a scheme like this, would go into the spirit world and pass the idea by both God and Satan, and if they agreed on it, then he'd go ahead and try to enact it. Was he making this up? I doubt if it would sound so weird if he was. Right? It seems to me, whatever was going on, this guy had these visions, whatever they were. Naturally, I think they were coming from within his mind, and that would make him delusional, possibly a schizophrenic. And yet Reverend Moon was very, very capable of operating. He was a successful businessman. He was a politician. He was a very canny and intelligent guy. So he didn't belong in a straitjacket, right? But something was very different about him. Now, Jim Jones, he was very similar, except he was a little more disturbed, and you know what finally happened, right? He became a cult leader. He thought he knew best and tried to control everybody's lives in the cult. And once he felt he was cornered, then he got everybody to commit suicide. And so there's one where the guy goes over the line, as I believe Reverend Moon or Joseph Smith did not. It's a fascinating thing. I have an article in, I think it's in my book, Latter-day Scripture, Studies in the Book of Mormon, a reprint of an article that appeared in Free Inquiry once called Joseph Smith, Liar, Lord, or Lunatic. And I try to explain, against a background of gurus, messiahs, saints, and sages of all different eras, that Smith was a liar, a lunatic, and a lord. That you can't. They're not really alternatives. That might be interesting. I think it's relevant to the subject. Okay, finally, Jason says, before hearing the lecture, I always imagined biblical prophets as some kind of charlatan, equivalent to these modern-day evangelical preachers, using charm and charisma to extract power and influence over a population. After the lecture, though, I can't help but imagine them as the victims of their own minds. What does it mean for the Bible if we view Paul, Abraham, Moses, etc. as schizophrenics rather than prophets? Well, Jason, again, I wouldn't oppose the two. When we say a poet is inspired by the muse, well, we don't any longer believe that the actual muses, these goddesses, were whispering anything to him, right? But we are recognizing that there's this creativity in the subconscious that comes through. And I certainly have, not that I'm on the exalted level of any of these people, but I am very much aware that what creativity I have is not the result of conscious device on my part. It comes, fortunately for me, very easily from the subconscious. I'm aware of things popping into my head, so to speak. Well, I think that's a mental condition, but not a harmful one. Though most creative people are, studies show, some sort of at least borderline schizoid personality. And I think it has to do with the wiring. It's a pretty chancy business. It's easier to be healthy and mundane. So I wouldn't put it past them. The real question is, as you say, are they charlatans or victims or hosts of divine madness? Of course, you can be both. I kind of think Joseph Smith and Jim Jones were both, and it's very difficult to draw a line there. There were suspicions in the ancient world of people who were ostensibly prophets, like Lucian of Samosata in the 2nd century wrote this fascinating thing, Alexander the Quack Prophet, where he explained how a still-going cult of an oracle, a human-headed snake, who would give people oracles from the shadows of a circus tent, basically, how this was fabricated cynically to rake in the money, or Proteus Peregrinus, the passing of Peregrinus. This guy was a grandstanding faker who was willing to carry the shtick so far as to immolate himself just for the glory of it. Was he an investigative reporter? Is there any way he could have known this, or was he just surmising it because he was a cynic and couldn't take these cults seriously? I don't know. This is what must have gone on. So even the ancients had suspicions, and they no doubt had reason. I mean, there have always been charlatans and fakes. They even had a word for it. One of the words for magician, goetes, implies kind of a faker, a medicine show charlatan. But like Apollonius of Tyana was considered that by outsiders. But there were plenty of people that thought, no, you're just slandering the guy. Well, who knows? It's tough to tell, and sometimes they can be both. Okay, I got a request here from Simon Magus. Oh, no, wait a minute. That's not him, is it? Oh, boy. No, I guess it is Simon Magus. Must be pretty old by now. Please read this in the manner of Dale Gribble. In Genesis 3:22, God kicks Adam and Eve out of the garden so they can't eat from the tree of life and live forever. Or at least that's what the government wants you to think. Dale's own prescription. He says, I'm not going to die. What is it? Chromium picolinate, every orifice, every day. Anyway, isn't it implied that Adam and Eve would have lived forever before they ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil? What was the point of the tree of life if they would have lived forever anyway? What kind of lefty hootenanny is this? Did Adam and Eve have to keep eating from the tree of life to stay alive before they were exiled, or was this a discrepancy that the aliens, working in conjunction with the Illuminati, simply overlooked when they wrote the Bible? Actually, I think you've said what was going on. I think the implication is that they could have eaten of the tree of life and would have continued to eat it with God's blessing, because he didn't want to have to replace them. He doesn't want them to learn to procreate. He didn't even want a wife for Adam. And once he made her, she wasn't supposed to be a wife, just a helper, a companion, like the animals would have been had they been able to speak. That's why God creates animals in the Garden of Eden story, to keep the man company, but they're not good enough, and apparently because they can't speak. Right? And so he makes another humanoid, and there she is. But he doesn't want him to procreate, and it's the serpent that tells him about the tree of carnal knowledge, what it's really good for. And so he wanted the man and, the woman to live forever, to keep servicing the garden, which was the garden of God and his divine colleagues, Jehovah and the rest of them. The implication, I think, is that the tree of life was what Jehovah and the other gods ate to keep them alive, just like the Greek gods. They ate ambrosia and drank nectar. They had to have the sustenance of sacrifices, etc., or they would die. And so he wanted them to eat that. But the tree of knowledge, procreation, well, the gods procreated. There were various demigods and all that, but they didn't want the humans to, because the humans in number would come to rival the gods, especially if they live forever. So once they can reproduce and have theoretically infinite prolongation of the species, the price for that was you yourself as an individual will not go on and on. So I'm assuming, at least it seems to imply to me, that the tree of life was to be eaten again and again to keep you youthful and alive, even as the gods did. The tree of knowledge was not. Now, this means that one bite from the fruit of life would not do the trick, right? You'd have to return to it. But when it says, now lest he put forth his hand and take of the tree of life and live forever, ... kicks them out of the garden, so they have no access to it. Does that kind of sounds like one bite would have done it. It would have given the man and the woman eternal life. But on the other hand, he does bar them from access to it with the flaming sword and the cherub and all that. Maybe that implies he doesn't want them to return, to have open access to it forever. And even if they had eaten it, it wouldn't have carried on for eternity, but it does imply that they had not availed themselves of it yet, and that they weren't going to get the chance to. But in general, it's the way I read it, it seems to imply that one would have to continually eat of it, which is no big deal. We do that anyway, right? We stay alive by eating. Well, these guys could have stayed alive forever by eating this repeatedly. So I think that's really what's going on there. One bite wouldn't have done it in the context of the whole story. Thanks, Simon. Thanks, Dale. But the clones of Adam and Eve... Well, sorry. Okay, this from Robert, the fellow Robert. There's something about that name. Anyway, greetings and salutations, Bible Geek. Since it's the same name, I'm doing the same voice as me. I have some... something's missing here, but at any rate, here's the questions. One, does the Geek have any teaching philosophy? Specifically, the Geek has made an effort to exemplify intellectual honesty and independent critical thought. Does the Geek have any ideas pedagogically on how to engender this attitude in students? Yeah, as I learned from my dear friend and mentor George Cronk, philosophy professor at Bergen Community College, it's very important to observe the principle of charity and argumentation. That is to not only avoid making a straw man of an argument you don't agree with, oversimplifying it, making it look stupid, but even if it is not well expressed, you try to improve it and say, now, as I understand it, this is the point they're trying to make. Or you could say, I don't think they make a good case, but here's probably a better one you could make for this view, though here's why I don't accept it. So the principle of charity and argument. I don't mean just being polite, though that's very important too. But assuming the stronger reading of the stronger presentation, because you're not trying to score points against a guy on a debate platform. You're trying to get at the truth, to evaluate arguments, and so you take the strongest possible form of the argument you're refuting. But you also make it plain how much you know and how much you don't know, that you say, well, here's how I see it, here's why, of course, I could be wrong. I'm willing to rethink this. Now, that, I think, shows people that you're impartial and tends to influence them. Somebody's going to say, wow, that's the stance I want. I want the truth, not just reinforcement of my pet view. So that kind of tentativeness and And George, by the way, was a believer is a believer in the Eastern Orthodox faith. I think he's Orthodox Church in America. He argues for that based on the ontological argument of St. Anselm and so forth, but I've heard him revise his opinions on that, and he will tell you that it's faith. And if he believes in angels, for instance, he'll say, you can't prove this, but I think we have the right to believe certain things on this and that basis, and that faith is not knowledge in the philosophical sense of justified true belief. I found his making these distinctions and his love for the truth wherever it may wind up, and the manifest attitude that he had about that to be inspiring and to make me want to be the same way. Similarly, and this comes up in apologetics and debates with apologists, I think it's important to, when presenting a view, a doctrine, whatever, to try to place yourself in the shoes of the people who do believe it, to make the case they would make if they were there. And then also when you say why you're not persuaded of it, if it's somebody else's view, the thing I try to do is to say, look, I am not trying to convince you, I'm just explaining, like the resurrection, the historicity of the Gospels. When I criticize these views, I'll say, look, I was an apologist for the faith. These problems made me turn away from it. You may see it better than I do. You have to draw your own conclusions, but I'm just telling you that this is what I think and why. You decide for yourself. And that way that puts them more at ease and challenges them, because it's less likely they're going to think of me as an enemy assaulting them and automatically, reflexively defend their favorite view. What do I care what they think, right? I mean, I'm sincere about this. I don't care what anybody thinks. I want to publish my views to enrich the discussion, to give people more fodder as they make their own synthesis, a lifetime project as it is with me. And so my approach that I try to communicate is, don't we want the truth as close as we can get to it? Here's something more to think about. You decide what you think best. And that way, I think it enables them to think that, yeah, he's just supplying the smorgasbord. I love to go to these deadly fried food buffets around here in eastern North Carolina. Oh, the fried fish, the fried chicken, stuff like that, pulled pork, and so on. Well, frequently, as you're in line filling your plate, you have to stand aside while somebody comes out from the kitchen to refill the various pans. Well, I want people to know that that's what I am. I'm supplying the food for them to eat and enjoy and ingest and digest. It's up to them. But I think my goal is to enrich the discussion and to provide material for them to chew over. Also, like Socrates, I want to be a midwife. I want to help people make connections, but I do not want to maneuver them into agreeing with me. What is the point of that? Right? That would just be an ego trip if I wanted followers. If the guy who asked a good question on Facebook the other day in the Bible Geek listeners thing, how should we approach the debate over the Christ mythicism? Well, I haven't responded there. Wasn't, and I probably won't, except here, and I don't really care what happens with the debate on mythicism. It's not some gospel I preach. I don't think the world would be better off if everybody believed Jesus didn't exist. What do I care? I mean, that would be megalomania to think that that there's some great issue here that rests on my shoulders. Of course not. That's kind of the way I just find it an interesting topic. I know some other people do, and so I share some ideas and so on. But what's at stake? What are you driving at? That has a lot to do with a pedagogical approach. Two other things quickly. Depending on the topic, I don't just gush out my views, my religious views or lack of religious views or whatever. I would like to have what I say speak for itself and to keep the student guessing. Now, I don't really positively try to keep my opinions a secret, but I don't want them to write off what I'm saying as rationalization for a view they don't hold. Right, so I think it's important to hide behind the information as long as you can, while not ducking questions. Just, if you can, present it without the context of you, then all the better. And then, of course, I think humor is very important. I'm just a smartass anyway, so it's not like it's a considered choice, but I have found over decades that's sort of sugar that makes the medicine go down. And it also shows that you can sit loose enough to the data and the ideas to have fun with them, and that helps people understand that the beliefs, in a sense, are not sacrosanct. You shouldn't be afraid to question them, and so on. So that's some, again, chaotic rantings about the approach I take. Second question from Robert: is the Geek familiar with John Hick and his form of religious pluralism? What do you think about that? Yeah, I think that what Hick is doing is to create a kind of doctrine of religious pluralism, a framework whereby one can embrace all of the religions as true in some sense, but it seems to me a bit reductionistic. At least I've read some of his books some years ago, and I could be remembering it, if that's a word. He seems like to make all of the founders prophets, which is truncating several of these religions who do not make their founders simply revealers or prophets, but rather avatars, manifestations of God, incarnations, and so forth. So I think there's the danger of homogenizing all of them, in a sense, for your own convenience. You don't want to have to reject the other religions than your own, and so you try to redefine them in a way, including your own, that would enable everybody to kind of sign on the dotted line. But I don't see the utility of that, since you're cutting out the people that believe in the more miraculous, spectacular notions of Muhammad, Jesus, the Buddha, and so on. It's a big step toward just religious humanism, which is fine. I mean, that's a good view, but it's one more view. You're not really reconciling all the religions that way. And I think pluralism has to be on a different footing. You have to say that all the faiths are irreconcilable insofar as you take theology seriously, which the majority of the adherents of each one of them do. Right? There are a lot of people that will say, if you reduce all the religions to a single mystical core, you're denying my religion. I think it really matters that Muhammad was the seal of the prophets, or that Jesus had divine and human natures and all that stuff. So you're not bringing everybody under the umbrella, even though you think you are. I think it has to be more of a platform for respectful and self-critical dialogue. If I understand it correctly, that's kind of the approach Tillich took. He said, you can't have meaningful interreligious dialogue unless all the members, the parties to the dialogue, actually do believe in their religions. If they're willing to give away the store, like some people have said, hey, in fact, another professor of mine, Eva Fleischner, she was very involved in Jewish-Christian dialogue, but I felt she kind of gave away the store. She wound up saying that Christians should, in the light of Jewish beliefs, regard Jesus as a kind of new Abraham. That might not be a bad idea, but you're not getting Christians on board with that. That's not really Christian. I mean, it's, again, a kind of a religious humanism, which I'm all for. That's fine with me, but you're not really you're not really working out a way to affirm that everybody's right. So I have some hesitations about the viability of Hick's view, though I don't think it's a bad view. I just think it doesn't solve the problems it's trying to. I like John Hick, though. He's a good thinker, good author. Lastly, what is the geek's favorite flavor of pizza? Well, there's only one answer to that: pepperoni. The second is like unto it: pepperoni and anchovy. Also like meatball, sausage, sometimes hamburger, pizza, but I tell you that the divine pepperonius, that's really the way to go for me. So, what a great step forward in the history of civilization. Pizza. Ooh, let me see here. David Ellis Dickerson. Having listened to the podcast for years now, I find I'm a minimalist on the Old Testament and a mythicist on Jesus, and getting that way on Paul. However, I sometimes find it hard to figure out what the actual timeline for everything is from a minimalist perspective. When did the Babylonians relocate the Jews and supply them with a homeland myth? Well, it'd probably be about 530 BCE, I would think. What happened before then? Where do these older myths and traditions like Deuteronomy 20 come from if their writing was late? Well, they may have been genuinely very ancient. No doubt they were in one form or another, since we find a lot of the Genesis myths closely paralleled in Greek mythology. And I mean, think about the fact that we still know about the labors of Hercules now. Right? He's still a popular culture hero. I mean, these things persist. So they could be very, very old. If Jesus didn't exist, then where are the early fathers in comparison with Thomas and, something late like 2 Peter? Well, I think the canonical books, as well as Thomas, probably go back to the mid-2nd century, perhaps a little bit later, depending on the genuineness of some of the apostolic fathers and apologists, because there are like works accredited to Tertullian and Justin Martyr and Athanasius that we now know they didn't write, and it's been suggested that by one of the Tübingen critics that Irenaeus' Against Heresies is not actually by Irenaeus. Now, if that's true, then the sky's the limit, practically, as to when the Gospels could have been written. But I've never been able to track down the argument for that. And of course, with Jesus, there are different estimates as to what century he lived in, and if he is a consolidation of earlier dying and rising God myths and different Jesus figures. It's hard to know when you want to pinpoint the origin of the Jesus myth. 2 Peter, certainly something like the middle of the 2nd century. Upshot, can someone give me a comprehensive minimalist timeline, maybe with some sources, in case I'm challenged to explain it all someday? At the Last Judgment? Hallelujah! I think Niels Peter Lemche, Lemche, in a couple of his books, has some very helpful essays about the relative dating and relative writing of the Old and New Testaments, the Septuagint, and so forth. And I would take a look at an essay of mine that appears in, oh boy, I think it's in The Amazing Colossal Apostle, about the relative dates of the Gospels and the epistles. Does the Christ myth theory require an early date for the epistles? That kind of gets into the issue of relative dating. I'll have to think about it if I remember to, and I welcome other people's suggestions. I know John Felix, Stephen Stiles, and others have thought a great deal about this, and welcome their viewpoints. But those are the sources I would go to, because I think most even critics and even Christ mythicists assume an unrealistically early date and degree of authenticity for the Pauline epistles. I think that's a big mistake, personally. So I'd take a look at The Amazing Colossal Apostle and I forget, Niels, Niels, Peter Lemke, Lemche. Take a look in Amazon, and there's a couple of books there I think will strike you. Very, very fascinating. A lot of stuff is probably a lot later than we thought. There's some new stuff out on the 2nd century date of the Gospels as well. But that's it for me for today, and hopefully I'll be back with you again a lot sooner than the last time. So again, if you have some extra bucks to donate to the Geek and his family, I'm ashamed to ask, but you can keep this ministry going by helping pay our utility bills. Okay, but at any rate, you keep listening and sending in those questions, and I'll see you next time on The Bible Geek.
The Bible Geek was recorded by Robert M. Price and produced by John Felix and Sergeant Jovanovich. Theme song by John Morris. Visit us at robertmprice.mindvendor.com for more info on Robert's projects, purchase Bible Geek merchandise, and click the ever-important Donate button. Send your questions to criticus@aol.com, and be sure to rate and review The Bible Geek on iTunes. Thanks for listening to The Bible Geek. I'm Torrin Atkinson.